Coming up in this episode.
I think when we go to see a film, I do think there's something about watching the hero change, which is valuable. The illusion of escape and freedom actually reinforces the conformity because we have the illusion of choice and freedom. I felt that there was a kind of some sort of big cultural lie being perpetrated.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, George Lucas said, "I came to the conclusion that mythology was a tool, a psychological tool to help you find your place in the world. When I was writing Star Wars, I consciously set about to recreate myths and the classic mythological motifs. It is possible that if I hadn't run across Joe Campbell, I'd still be writing Star Wars today." So that was writer and director George Lucas talking about how the idea of mythology, and in particular how the work of American writer Joseph Campbell, influenced his work on Star Wars. To Campbell, the plot of Luke Skywalker going from innocent farm boy to hero of the galaxy was far from new. In an interview talking about Star Wars, Campbell stated that there is a certain typical sequence of actions which can be detected in stories from all over the world and from many, many periods of history. Campbell called this sequence of actions the hero's journey, and we see the same narrative play out again and again and again in film, in theatre and in literature. From King Lear to The Lion King, from The Matrix to Moana, from the story of Jesus Christ to the enlightenment of Buddha, an absurd amount of stories we hear follow similar three-act narrative arcs. But why? Is it just good storytelling? Or are these stories hacking our brains' evolutionary design to crave progress, mastery, and meaning? To chat about the pervasiveness of the hero's journey and the psychology behind its longevity, I am so chuffed to be joined by writer and radio producer Eliane Glaser. Eliane has written on topics ranging from digital bureaucracy, elitism, and the lies of modern life, and her most recent book is called Motherhood, Feminism's Unfinished Business. And in May, she published an article in Aeon magazine called Our Narrative Prison, which explored this persistence of the hero's journey narrative in our culture. Hello, Eliane.
Hello, Paul. Nice to be talking with you.
Oh, absolute pleasure. I mean, I really did genuinely love reading your article when I came across it. And because it took me back 30 years to when I was first read Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And at the time, I was studying for my undergraduate degree. And I remember just being bowled over by the idea that I guess so many of the films that I had watched, the TV shows as well, and the books that I read, I guess all had that same underlying premise. And I was quite an annoying psychology nerd, probably not changed, but I remember boring my friends in the student union bar about the sort of bigger meaning behind this. You know, was it just a coincidence? Was it a conspiracy? Or was it really sort of our eternal struggle for identity seeping out of the collective unconscious? You know, all these big thoughts. I said all annoying. But I think straight away I'm going too deep, too quickly. Let's get into what it is. I think many of the people listening may not know of Joseph Campbell, may not know of the hero's journey, but they would have certainly come across it in different ways. I guess, how would you describe that hero's journey in very simple terms?
Yes, and just to begin with, I also shared your sort of light bulb moment when I first read the description of this basic plot, and I suddenly recognised it in so many films I'd seen, and had the same thoughts and questions. How can it be that all these films in particular, but also plays and many books, have the same plot? And is this a convention? Is this hardwired into the human brain? And not just blockbuster films, but also art house films as well, which is very interesting because I think we tend to think of those films as being more free or alternative or doing something different. So I guess to summarise the story of the hero's journey, we meet and maybe we can talk about examples in a minute, but the basic structure is we meet the hero in their ordinary world, and they're kind of plodding along. They're not living their best life, but things are okay. It's kind of manageable imperfection, acceptable imperfection, I think one critic has called it.
Yeah.
And then there's an inciting incident, which is a bolt from the blue. Something comes along and knocks them out of their ordinary world. It changes everything for them. It makes it impossible for them to carry on as normal. The hero is then pulled into a quest, which they initially resist as hard as they can. But then at a certain point, the midpoint of the story, they're pulled into this quest, and it's a kind of point of no return. They're on this new journey. On their journey, they meet a sort of wise guide who shows them a completely different way of being or living. And they think that kind of completely explodes their normal sort of mindset, all their values, and they think, have I been living a lie? And then from that point on, they're on this journey, but they're opposed by an antagonist. And this antagonist disrupts their quest, and the antagonist gets more and more powerful. So that they get to a lowest point, our hero, where they think that they can't prevail. The antagonist is at their most powerful. And then at that point, they will either prevail over their antagonist, over their adversary or adverse situation, or they will fail. So, and if they fail, it's a tragedy. If they succeed, it's not. And then they return to their ordinary life at the end of the story. And everything kind of seems the same, but also they are completely transformed. Everything is also completely different. So their worldview has been transformed. So that's the kind of basic structure of the hero's journey.
And I think listening to that, I'm straight away thinking of examples. I mean, it's almost hard to think of examples that don't follow that in some way. Have you got any examples in your mind that I guess adhere to that? I mean, we mentioned Star Wars, and I think I'll talk about that in a minute because it very closely follows that. But it's more than that, isn't it? Yeah.
So, and the examples are really, do bring it to life, and you think, oh my goodness, it's just in every film. So, well, Forrest Gump, he's living his ordinary life in Alabama. Interstellar, Cooper, the protagonist, he's an American farmer. He's kind of getting by. It's a sort of dystopian kind of future. His crops are failing, so he's just about scraping by. Matilda, she's sort of ignored by her neglectful parents. Groundhog Day.
Yeah. Oh, yes, of course. Wonderful film. And a lot of people say Groundhog Day is kind of uses a different story arc. It's great in that repeating pattern, but actually it's still about the hero's journey, isn't it?
It is. And the interesting thing is, so they're leading an imperfect life, but they also have a flaw, the hero. So in Groundhog Day, Bill Murray is kind of cynical. I mean, I'm quite ambivalent about Groundhog Day because I really like his cynicism, and I don't want him to change. But he's kind of this sort of jaded snob at the start of that film, and then also Finding Nemo is a film that very closely conforms to the hero's journey structure. So Marlin, the dad fish, is overprotective of Nemo, because they've suffered a trauma and. So he won't let Nemo go out and explore the world. So that's his flaw, is that he's overprotective. But, even classic literature like Jane Austen's Emma, she's kind of self-centered. And so she's going to go on a journey.
She's matchmaking a friend, isn't she?
Right. I don't know. It's been a long time since I read that novel. But that book is a kind of an education of Emma, isn't it? She becomes less kind of selfish. Then the inciting incidents. So inciting incidents are kind of my favourite aspect of this in a way, because they're always different. So And I suppose one of my fundamental points about this is that we go into the cinema wanting escape. We want to be exposed to something completely different, and be surprised. And that's why the fact that the hero's journey is so samey, is such a paradox, because we want escape, we want freedom, we want to be taken somewhere completely new. And the inciting incident really encapsulates this, because the inciting incident is not only a complete surprise to the protagonist, to the hero, but it's also completely different. Well, there's often like an inciting incident can be a death. It can happen before the film starts. So often films begin with a group of people brought together for a funeral. So there are some common patterns to inciting incidents, but generally they are kind of radically different, both to the protagonist and to the viewer. So examples are, the witch's prophecy in Macbeth.
Oh yeah.
Dorothy being swept up in her tornado.
Oh, yeah,
very
classic
obvious,
one. Yes.
Classic one. In Citizen Kane. So when Charles Foster Kane says the word rosebud on his deathbed, and that sets off this quest to try and understand what that means.
Yeah.
So other examples, Clarice Starling being assigned to interview Hannibal Lecter.
It's everywhere, isn't it? When you start
everywhere.
analysing it. And I think that's why I got so excited when I read your article, and it reminded me of you reading Joseph Campbell, that this sort of structure is everywhere. And it might be disguised, in different ways. And I know in your article you mention, I think it was Vogler talking about, it's a skeleton which story writers should cover up as best as possible, whether they do that or not, because some stories are less covered up than others. But I think it's just really interesting. And Joseph Campbell also talks about this sort of 3 acts. You went into quite a lot of detail with all the little elements in there, but in the basis of it, he talks about 3 acts, doesn't he? With the departure being the first sort of act, where that hero, as you say, leads a normal life, little sense of greatness, really, happily bumbling along before being called on an adventure. And even if you just take that bit, that first sort of departure bit, I mean, yes, you've got Luke Skywalker living on Tatooine with his aunt and uncle, an innocent farm boy, doesn't want to do anything else. Harry Potter living at home with the Dursleys before his invitation to Hogwarts and that initiating event. Neo in The Matrix working his corporate 9 to 5 before being contacted by Morpheus. Moana wishing she could go beyond the reef. I mean, it just goes on, and I got lists and lists and lists of them. But also you've got things not maybe popular culture in the terms of films, media. But I mentioned Jesus, for instance, humble carpenter before being baptized by John and hearing God's voice. You've got, as I say, Buddha Siddhartha, going through that time of moving away and then going through turmoil. That the story is so old. It's not a new thing, is it? And I find that amazing. And I realise I've just said the first section as well. So the first act is the departure. The second is the initiation, where the hero enters that new world, strange world, a magical world maybe, faces challenges, meets friends, fights foes, but most importantly learns lessons from that. So Luke meeting Yoda, undergoing training, becoming a fighter pilot, obviously facing Darth Vader, classic, following that trope. And then they come back, as you say, that return is the third act. The hero comes back and they've changed in some way. Their adventure has moved them and dramatically changed them. And Campbell talks about they then can go on to help others as well because they have changed. So Moana, returning to her island, becomes the true leader. Pretty much the same plot as The Lion King as well. Neo becoming the one, that sort of ending there. And, I do find it amazing. But how did you first come into it? Why was it of interest to you?
Yeah, and I just want to add also another of my favourite examples before I answer that. So Hamlet as well, another really classic historic example. So Hamlet resists his father's ghost's order to avenge his death, and then But when he kills Polonius, that really sets the action going on his journey, the point of no return. So what got me interested in it? So, well, two things really. One is that I felt that that there was a kind of some sort of big cultural lie being perpetrated. And I suppose it's a lie of, modern consumer capitalism, that we live in this age which is supposedly an age of unprecedented freedom and choice, and yet the cultural products that we consume give an illusion of freedom and choice, because there's always this fresh premise. There's a hero's journey. The hero is ostensibly has free will. The inciting incident is always a bolt from the blue. So we go into the cinema looking for this escape and looking to consume an entirely new story. But then the films come back again and again to this same formula. And so the sameness is disguised as variety, which is suspicious to me. It's almost as if, it's a kind of an illusion of freedom, I suppose, that's being given to us in the form of these ostensibly, different, various, endless variety of different cultural products. But also that the conformity, the illusion of escape and freedom actually reinforces the conformity, because we have the illusion of choice and freedom, which acts like a sort of safety valve and reinforces, convention. So at the end of every film, this kind of reset when the hero returns to their ordinary life, it's almost always the case that the kind of external conditions of their life are unchanged. And so I'm suspicious of that, because it prevents us from imagining different ways to live, or different, ways to organise our society. It kind of reinforces a sort of conventional worldview. I mean, there's a brilliant scene in The White Lotus where I can't remember which season it is. I think it might be 2. Yeah, season 2, where the married guy, he kind of gives this crazy speech when he sort of goes off on this bender. He's been married for decades. He meets a newlywed woman on her honeymoon. He just says, marriage, it's just, it's a bourgeois convention. Why are we still living like this when there's so many different ways we could be living? But then when he kind of comes back to his senses at the end of the series, he kind of gets back together with his wife, kind of normal, conventional nuclear family.
So he challenges the convention, but ultimately goes back to it.
And that's a kind of repeated pattern. American Beauty is another interesting kind of midlife. There's lots of midlife crisis movies, where he is tempted by this young woman, but eventually just is reconciled with his wife. And so, I'm not saying that.
So would you be more interested when they do break convention, I guess?
Well, I suppose it's just, I'm suspicious of the endlessly repeated reinforcement of the conventional norm, but disguised by this sort of illusion of escape and challenge, I suppose is what I'm saying. So that's one thing that led me into this topic. The other thing is that I am quite, I suppose, I'm a good, conscientious person. I'm very hardworking, a bit of a workaholic, quite sort of, I suppose not exactly locked down in my habits, but I don't like it when, say, there's a snow day and my children can't go to school, or there's some transport strike, or they're ill and they have to take a day off school and my working routine is disrupted. I get this kind of panic. Oh God, I need my self-validation from a good day's work, and now that's been disrupted. So I became very interested in this idea of disruption of your normal plans, and the inciting incident sort of embodying this disruption. And for example, there's a scene in a very old film, which is not that great film, but it's called Something Wild. There's a guy, he's working in finance. Melanie Griffiths comes along. She disrupts his working day. They go on this huge road trip, and at one point she gets his smartphone and she throws it out the window. And I just love that, because we're all kind of addicted to our phones and our routines and our work and our forms of validation, and workaholism, or our routines, they close us down as people, and they do stop us kind of really being alive in our own lives, and not having a sort of deadened routine. So I'm very interested in inciting incidents as a way of modelling a mechanism for change, and because the inciting incident embodies the very thing that we need, but that we don't want. So in that example, throwing the phone out of the window, that's a very clear example. We have this great resistance to having our routines disrupted, but actually it's the best thing for us. We just don't know it yet.
Yeah.
And by the end of the film, usually what happens is that the protagonist, the hero, has realised that that's what they need. So Carl Jung had this very helpful concept of the shadow self. Yeah. And so the shadow self is the part of you that you suppress, that you think is bad, or you've been taught through your upbringing to reject or suppress. But actually, often your shadow self is a part of you that's very helpful. And that if you are able to integrate that within your whole self, then you'll be more healthy all round. So the inciting incident is almost like your shadow self that comes crashing into your life, and you resist it tooth and nail because you're just trying to go along as normal with your stubborn bad habits. But the hero's journey is a process of coming to realise that actually that thing that you were trying to resist with everything you've got is actually the thing that you really need.
Yes. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in your suspiciousness and your almost disappointment, it feels, that is coming across, that a lot of the stories go back to the convention again at the end. They explore that shadow, but ultimately they come back to realise that where they were originally was where they're happy almost. They've learnt things, yes, but they've come back. Could there be stories, or are there stories, where the shadow takes over, that actually they become that who they were was not right? And there aren't many stories, are there, that evil takes over and wins the day, for instance?
Well, I think there are tragedies where the hero doesn't succeed in their fight with the antagonist. But I think that mostly they do get that realization. So they get the realization, but unfortunately they don't prevail, and so they die or whatever. But I think I can't think of many examples. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I can't think of. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example where the tragedy is that they don't learn. Yeah. Because even like Oedipus does.
Yeah, I'd say Oedipus does. Romeo and Juliet?
King Lear, Romeo and Juliet.
I mean, not to spoil it, but it doesn't end up well for them, does it, at the end?
And actually, interestingly, the learning happens to the parents.
Okay.
Which is an interesting version of it.
Yeah.
There's also interesting examples where some people say that characters don't always change. So Erin Brockovich, she doesn't get together with the guy in the end. She rejects the guy, but I think she has changed because she's kind of become a lawyer of sorts. So, and she's kind of gained this professional persona that she didn't have before, as just a mum.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I see that. And I'm sure people
yeah,
listening would be shouting at their radios, telephones, whatever it is, with examples that they go, well, you should be thinking about this. And of course, there are going to be ones. But the point of the
yeah,
hero's journey is that the pervasiveness across the majority of things, and it was so easy to list things that follow that story arc, and actually trying to find the ones that don't is more of a struggle. I'm sure there are, for those listening, shouting, waiting for Godot at their phone, fair enough. But there are far, far more that sort of do follow it, I suppose. And before I go on, because I want to talk more about that psychology side, and you mentioned Jung, for instance, because I think he was a huge influence on Campbell's work. But before, you've mentioned the illusion of choice. And I find that fascinating as well as a psychologist. There's a great study by a psychologist called Sheena Iyengar, and she did a study on choice, and she presented a group of people who were doing some tasks. It was sort of their break time, and presented a choice of drink. And actually, like a lot of psychology experiments, that was actually the experiment, not the other thing that they were doing, which was just a bland task that they were asked to do. And they were given a range, I think it was 12 different types of soda. So Dr. Pepper, Coca-Cola, Fanta, lemonade, a range of drinks, basically. And they were asked to choose. Now, she did this and people had no problem choosing. They all went for their favourite and they gave a reason, what have you. But then she did the study. This was a study in America. She did the same study in Russia. And what happened there, they said, a lot of people said, I don't have a choice. You're not giving me a choice. And she said, well, there's 12 different options. And they said, but they're all just fizzy drink. You're offering me fizzy drink in a different shape, that's all. But there's no choice. You're not offering me milk or water and a fizzy drink. That would be a choice. And that's where she got this idea of the illusion of choice. That actually, if all you give people is fizzy drink, you're giving that illusion that they can choose. But actually, they've just got a sugary fizzy drink that's flavoured slightly differently to the other one. It's not really a choice. And that resonates with me when you said that illusion of choice, that in films, more than ever before, we have a huge choice when we go to the cinema of what to see. And I made a list before speaking to you of what's in the cinema, my cinema, right now. And How to Train Your Dragon is just come out. Absolutely typical hero's journey story arc where a character called Hiccup is sort of in his village, happily going along, but not being a dragon fighter. He's not strong enough to be a dragon fighter until he meets this dragon called Toothless, and they go on an adventure, and he learns about himself, comes back to teach the others. Classic. Lilo and Stitch is out. I didn't know about Lilo and Stitch. I had to look it up. But Stitch is an alien, comes down, goes through a learning journey, changes things, helps the family, and helps him, and helps his planet. So it's still a hero's journey. Mission Impossible, well, we don't even need to talk about that one, obviously. Ballerina, that's John Wick style character. Again, follows that same story arc. And coming out next week is Formula One, the movie. Again, same story. So we have that illusion that we can go and see 5 different films there. All of them, though, are the same story arc in them. Is that depressing for you?
well, it's so interesting, isn't it? And it's interesting to think also whether this formula is it hardwired, in which case it's appealing to a really deep and profound human truth that's helpful to us, or is it just this kind of Hollywood formula that has been perpetuated through screenwriting classes where they teach the formula in quite a lot of specific detail. So I think it's depressing insofar as it is a commercial formula for success, which is being taught in LA. And so, but it's really interesting what you're saying about freedom and choice, because going back to the inciting incident, the reason why I think the inciting incident is so interesting is that it's very ambiguous whether it's an escape from our kind of stubborn problems. So we go to the cinema, we absorb these Hollywood products as a form of escape, and that makes us not sit with our problems and think clearly? Or is the inciting incident, does it model a mechanism for change that is really helpful for us psychologically? So I think that's why I keep returning to the inciting incident, because I think there's a real paradox there. I mean, I think in terms of freedom and whether it's good for us, I think there's also a paradox there, because on the one hand, it's not good for us to be fed an illusion of freedom and an escape and possibility, for that only to be foreclosed through the kind of disguised reassertion of the formula. But Julian Baggini, the philosopher, has written a very interesting book about freedom, where he says that actually, rather like those Soviet people from the Soviet bloc, or former, we've grown up in a kind of communist tradition of not having that consumerist choice. And there's this phrase, the tyranny of choice, that actually what we don't want freedom. It's not helpful for us. We just want to be, so for example, the COVID lockdown, I think part of the reason, in a way that was a kind of global inciting incident.
Very much, yeah.
It disrupted all of our patterns. And although it was a horrible experience for many people, many other people found it very helpful psychologically, because suddenly they didn't have all of these choices of what to do. There was just one thing we could do, which was to stay at home or go for a walk in nature. And it was, I think lots of people found it very psychologically helpful to have all of those choices removed. And some of that learning that people did was like the hero's journey learning, finding out what's important, spending time when you actually have to spend time with your family and you can't escape. Actually, you end up often finding out that you kind of go deeper into those relationships and discover something very valuable. And the same, obviously, with nature and changing challenging overwork and so on. So,
but have we gone back? I mean, following that, as you said before, a lot of the time, we've learned something through COVID. It might be that we can work from home, that you say you can go for nature walks rather than do other things. But have we now gone back to where we were?
Yeah, I think we have. And I think collectively, I was very dismayed that this year's the 5th anniversary of the lockdowns, and there was very little discussion of the positive lessons that we learnt as a society. Those lessons really feel like they've been forgotten collectively, and I find that very depressing. So it was almost like the world kind of telling us, this is your last chance to kind of, stop flying around the world, stop distracting yourselves through overwork, spend time with your friends and family, listen to nature, value nature and so on. So, so I think we haven't learnt the lessons. So collectively, if we are collectively a hero, we are not learning the lessons that we should have done from that, which were valuable lessons. In terms of cultural, films and so on, I think again, it's a paradox. I think when we go to see a film, I do think there's something about watching the hero change, which is valuable, because there is something, it's very, very difficult to think about our own stubborn flaws, and it's very difficult to change and to break out of our routines. And I think that there's something about the experience of seeing a film which does take us out of ourselves, enough to gain something of a objective insight into our own flaws. Whether we're actually able to then change or not, I think is a different question. I think that comes back to the vicariousness and the safety valve and the problem of that. But I think, it's also worth saying that, you mentioned examples of alternatives, and they do exist. So modernist literature, Mrs. Dalloway, this attempt to portray what it's like just to be in the world and have thoughts that swirl around your head, and that attempt to have a more realistic representation of what it's like to be human, rather than to shape experience into a hero's journey arc. Those experiments do exist. And I suppose I'm also thinking about Samantha Harvey's novel Orbital, where nothing much happens. And maybe she is also challenging the hero's journey in a kind of in a sort of dystopian, context, asking us to challenge those comforting narratives.
You mentioned in your article Rosalind Brown's book Practice as an example well.
Yeah.
And I hadn't read that, so I went to look it up. And in that, it's a story of a student, isn't it? And the sort of minutiae of the student's life as she's trying to finish an essay. Is that right?
It is. And so that's quite a modernist novel. So it's great because it's all about her random thoughts. Should she have a coffee now or wait? She's got the heating off. It's winter. How long can she hold out before putting the heating on? And so I love that attention to detail of what we actually think about, rather than being, we think we're so ends focused and results focused, but actually these kind of this minutiae of everyday life often knocks you off course and it distracts us from our main hero's journey quest. But the nice thing about that novel is that all of these distractions and evasions do end up amounting to the novel itself. So,
and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I looked it up and I went to the Amazon and read the description, and then I read the reviews, and there's only a couple of reviews, and one of them titled the review "Meandering," and it's that sort of feeling that it almost disappointed that reader that it didn't follow a traditional 3-act structure. It was meandering. It didn't go anywhere. And that was a disappointment for people. And I think that's interesting psychologically, because that need for something to be closed, to be finished, and to have that ending, which is positive most of the time, unlike tragedies, like you say, that also happen. And that need in us is reflected by the screenwriters rather than pushed on us by screenwriters. It could just be that is our nature. We want that wish fulfillment. We want that vicarious rehearsal of our lives, our problems, to be played out in front of us so we can learn from that. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, and I think that story structure is incredibly resonant for good reasons as well as bad. Yeah. But I think it's just that we are schooled in our sort of overwork culture to think, and also this, the whole self-optimization project and manifesting and success and so on, that it's just that our hero's journey life arc has been hacked by productivity obsession, and so we assume that the hero's journey should be to succeed. And I think it's helpful to realise that actually the hero's journey might be to chuck our phones out of the window and go on work less and think less about a success arc. But then that depends on whether you think the hero's journey is about life arcs, or whether it's more of a metaphor for change.
Yeah.
And I think as a metaphor for change, it's more helpful, but only if you see it as a mechanism for real change, rather than vicarious change.
And have you heard of narrative identity theory in psychology? It's pretty much that. It was first written by a psychologist called Dan McAdams, early 2000s, I think it was. And basically the idea is that in adolescence especially, we invent stories to make sense of our own lives. And the stories we tell ourselves go on to change us and develop who we are, basically. And as children develop into adults, they face the challenge of finding their role in the world, who they are, what do they believe, how do you fit in with others. So you experiment. You experiment with a range of different roles through your teenage years, especially. You almost like trying each on for size, shedding skins that become uncomfortable, and retaining parts that seem to fit with you, that sort of get you good reinforcement from others around you as well. And it sort of keeps developing and keeps developing. And it's sort of this idea that our identity is a constructed narrative. We're not born who we are, we become who we are. And seeing others struggle for personal growth, whether it's played out on the big screen, in the pages of the book you're reading, can actually help us to play out the scenarios in a safe space, I suppose. And you use the term rehearsal, and actually McAdams uses the term vicarious rehearsal in our identity, basically. And I think that is interesting as a psychological theory. I mean, when you watch Star Wars, I mean, no one's ever going to literally have a laser sword fight with your villainous father of a gantry and a planet-sized space station. I mean, it's not literal, but the essence of that inner hero facing that dark side of our own psyche is something we all go through. And I think also, you mentioned this, that the real world is chaotic. It is often meaningless. Things happen without a reason. But one of the things that we are, human beings are great at, or at least we've evolved to be very strong at, is creating a story of reason behind meaningless events. And that side of it, and can be played out in movie theatres, books, theatres. And is that why, for instance, that reviewer on Amazon said meandering? Because that reviewer was wanting to be able to live out something and see that conclusion, that satisfying conclusion. And when actually you just lose yourself in something which actually mirrors life too accurately, and it's meanderingness, it's nothingness, it's meaninglessness, that's disappointing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it comes down to what exactly is going on in that kind of, it's almost like a play space or a rehearsal space when you're in the cinema and you're watching somebody else being transformed. So what's kind of going on subconsciously with you? Is it kind of therapeutic process where you are actually changing on some level, or your subconscious is being worked on in a productive way? Or is it the opposite of that? Is it an escape from really sitting with your the way you are? and I think that's the question. That's the $1 million question. And I think there's something about modernist literature that gives you a jolt, that, something about the jolt away from the familiar, which does enable you to think. But then again, you could argue that the jolt is also the inciting incident, and by sitting in that darkened cinema space and going through that vicariously, that it could be that there is some helpful process going on there. I mean, I think in terms of that therapy, the narrative therapy, I mean, it's interesting. I've been reading recently about parts therapy, which I don't really know anything about, but the idea that that you have different parts inside you, rather like, I suppose, maybe related to Jung's shadow self, that there are different elements that make up your personality, and there's like people inside you, rather, in a way, so different selves that make up your whole self.
Almost the Inside Out film.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
But that was emotions, wasn't it? But
yes.
But these are kind of like roles that you might play. So you might have a perfectionist self, which and that's, you attach that to a story which is about your upbringing, your parents placing academic expectations on you, or whatever it is. So so you have that role within you, and parts therapy, as I understand it, is a way of understanding, kind of bringing out those different parts, observing them, analysing them, understanding where they come from, the narrative that they arise out of, and then maybe, dialing up some of them, dialing some of them down, the perfectionism, maybe turning that down a little bit. So I suppose the way of thinking about these stories and how they, this kind of essential, analysing stories to find this essential hero's journey structure, I think is really helpful, because even if the structure is hardwired and is psychologically incredibly profound, and even if it is everywhere, if you analyze it then and you understand it, then you can see it objectively. And I think that's very helpful, because then even if it is completely fundamental, we can see how it operates. We can see it as a model, sometimes as a formula, but also as a helpful mechanism. And so the reason why I wrote this article was to I suppose to bring the formula to the surface of our consciousness, so that we can understand what these films how they might be working on us, but also we can understand how they might be modelling a useful mechanism for change.
And I think that's really positive. I mean, bringing that sense of the hidden narrative into the conscious is a very good psychological technique for change. In a slightly different version, but it has distinct parallels. A study was done which said, how can we change teenagers' attitudes towards healthy food? And so they looked at a college in America and studied that. And they looked at advertising as well, and the narratives that advertising was putting out there. And they looked at things like McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken and energy drinks and that sort of advertising. And they went through a program with some students to show them the manipulative techniques that the advertising industry was using behind the scenes. So it might have just been an advert with Drake pushing a energy drink, but actually they were saying, look at how it's using words and narrative to get you to do what they want, which is, at the end of the day, spend your money on that drink. And by bringing that to consciousness, suddenly those students who had been taught that completely changed their eating behavior because of it. And not only was it just that week, they were taught, they did a longitudinal study, and a year afterwards, those students were still eating healthier and refusing and rebelling against that hidden narrative that the advertising that they brought to their consciousness. And so it can be a real catalyst for change when you suddenly bring that to consciousness. And I think that's great. I'm interested as well, do you think there is a correlation, I suppose, in the popularity of a hero's journey with what's happening in the real world?
Oh, that's so interesting. So in terms of our kind of collective course as humanity?
Yeah, I mean, things are happening in the world now. And we look into the cinema and we're seeing a lot of superhero films. We have for the past sort of 10, 15 years, I suppose. But a lot of our films are following that hero mentality at the moment. And I thought, well, okay, that's interesting. When was what was called the golden age of comic book heroes? I mean, you can't get more hero journey than actually literally superheroes, following their path and what have you, and vicariously living your life through Superman or Batman, whoever it may be. And actually, it was between 1938 and 1956. That's called the golden age of comic book heroes. That's when Superman, Batman, Captain America, Captain Marvel, Wonder Woman were all created. Now, obviously, there's a huge event that was happening between 1939 and 1945, bang in the middle of that golden era, where people were looking for something else. And I guess the hypothesis is that when you feel helpless in your own story, when you feel that you lack agency to be able to make any impactful mark on the world, do we actually turn to the fictional world to help to build our identity for us?
So interesting. I suppose that we have seen a turning away, in kind of broad brush political terms, we've seen a turning away from ideology and this idea of collective struggle or collective political project.
Yeah.
That we could collectively change the world for the better. And superheroes are a very individualized kind of alternative to that. That it's not about collective struggle or political projects. It's about being saved by an individual. And I suppose it's interesting that emerged. I suppose the Second World War was a manifestation of those ideologies going wrong. So perhaps that was the moment at which they said, oh, hang on a minute, these ideologies, whether that's, communism or fascism, have led us to a bad place. So let's
Yeah.
now try an alternative or individual model. But I think that individual model has really held sway
Yeah.
since then. And now, you could argue that having an individual hero's journey model is not great for being able to imagine collective struggles or collective projects.
And that's really interesting because we even look back on things like the war, don't we? The Second World War, and make it an individual story. Whilst the Second World War was obviously a collective project across countries, let alone across people, but actually people remember Winston Churchill won the war. They sort of reduce it down almost to a single individual who they can pin the badge on as being the individual hero, I suppose. And that's really interesting because that really wasn't the case.
And also, there are lots of films that were about an individual being I suppose, like Erin Brockovich or All the President's Men, and there's lots of examples of older films where there's an individual. The action is modelled on an individual because it's quite hard to represent a collective struggle. But the individual stands for a collective project, which is a good reforming project to help the world. I suppose what's happened now, I mean, I'm sure that people could think of counterexamples, but I think there are fewer examples of films set now where you have a protagonist who represents a good cause that can help the world, because there's a kind of pessimism about us being able to do that. And actually, in real life, it turns out that the world is now dominated by people who, in films, would be classic baddies, antagonists, villains. So it's almost like films of, real life has become we could think of sort of real life Bond villains, for example.
Oh, well, absolutely. You can imagine a sort of electric car manufacturer being a Bond villain, for instance, just off the top of my head.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then there's obviously lots of dystopian films, which are kind of fantasies of heroes or superheroes saving the world, but they're set in the future. So I think it has become quite hard to imagine a hero's journey narrative that's connected to a kind of an effective, broader project to improve things. So I think that is related. I think it's also interesting that that in this era of climate change and worries about the future, what does that do to the hero's journey story arc? How is it must be harder now to imagine that those sorts of journeys towards success and resolution and renewal and the reset that you get at the end of films when things do seem to be changing on a macro scale in a way that doesn't enable us to reset in that comforting way. But hence the fantasy, I guess, the fantasy genre and dystopian genre.
Yeah, very much. You mentioned that reset at the end of every film. You're going back, I suppose, to, and that does feel particularly conformist, doesn't it? Is as if we're invited to experience the fantasy of infinite possibility and radical change, only for that status quo to come back again. And that, is there a way out? Is there a way, or should there be a way to change that and do something different?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the reset, it's interesting because usually with the reset, the external structural conditions are unchanged. So that is kind of often, I think, politically conservative. But there's been an internal transformation. And you could argue that has a dramatic purpose, because the external conditions are the same, that really shows up the internal transformation by contrast. But I do think there's something problematic about that if you want to encourage people to change the world or change, structural conditions that we exist in. But on the other hand, if you think films are modelling a form of psychological change rather than political transformation, then that's okay. But I did speak to a filmmaker, Nakash Khalid, for this article I wrote, and he wrote and directed a film called In Camera that has an ensemble cast, and there isn't redemption at the end, and the protagonist is a struggling actor who is still struggling at the end of the film, which, does kind of accurately show things like economic precarity, difficulty in finding meaningful work and so on. So
would you class that film as sort of an art house film? It doesn't seem mainstream.
Yeah, I think it is an art house film, but I think that there are also plenty of art house films which do also follow the hero's journey formula,
of course,
to the letter. And that kind of relates to what you were saying about advertising, because it's important not just to analyse advertising and how that works, but also to think about anti-advertising. And I think that nowadays, there are lots of supposedly healthy foods which are actually very high in sugar, smoothies and so on. And there's forms of anti-advertising. So, for example, there's an advert for a jacket which says, "Don't buy this jacket," in big letters, and it's saying that this jacket is made from recycled materials and it lasts really a long time, so you don't need to buy a new jacket.
I see. So
it's a form of anti-advertising that's appealing to our resistance to being manipulated. But actually, that's an even more insidious form of manipulation, because it's designed to evade our defences against being hacked in that way. So, or it's a kind of even more sophisticated hack. And I suppose I see some more insidious products from Hollywood as being, having the trappings of art house, or looking like an art house film, but actually still conforming, and that being even more conservative, because we think that we are.
So they're almost wearing the clothes of an art house film to disguise themselves to come into your consciousness as something thoughtful and something a bit different. But actually, if they're still got the same story arc and reset at the end, it can be worse because it can feel more persuasive. Is that what you're thinking?
Exactly that, yeah.
I'm interested just finally to think again, and we have talked about this, but the psychological consequences, I guess, of consuming mainly one type of story. And we've talked about that sort of maybe over-reliance on the plot can have, I guess, behavioural downsides. Would you say it could shape unrealistic expectations of life for people?
I don't know. I mean, I think we come out of films, we've experienced catharsis, we're uplifted. We do feel like we've gained some sort of insight, don't we? Even just like if you cry on a plane when you're watching a film, and you have the sensation of being changed in some way, don't you?
Yeah. But like I say, does that actually lead to real change?
Does it lead to real change?
Or have we just passively let it wash over us? I mean, you've mentioned Jung a few times, and we haven't really gone into Jung's theory at all, but his archetypes and his idea is all about a metaphor for personal growth. That is what the archetypes are for, bridging that conscious and unconscious gap to achieve I think what you call a psychic wholeness. But does it really work?
Well, I mean, I suppose even the fact that I always remember that scene of throwing the phone out of the window from Something Wild. I think that it's almost like it's a visual sort of talisman you can carry around with you as a kind of a visual or a narrative reference point for some kind of thing you want to do, which is more intangible and more difficult and more intractable, like letting go of your attachment to productivity. I think that might help. And also, I suppose, there's a great film called Anomalisa, which is directed by Charlie Kaufman, I think.
Okay, yeah.
And the Kaufman brothers are very interesting in terms of reflecting and satirising the hero's journey formula. So they actually make films which are about that formula, and they subvert it in various ways. But Anomalisa is a film about a guy who's always looking for, I can't actually remember the plot very well, but it's something about a guy who's always looking for a new model, as in a new partner who's kind of shinier, younger, shinier, more attractive than his current partner.
Yeah.
And in the film, it's very cleverly done because it's sort of half cartoon, half live action. But in the film, he keeps Anomalisa. The name of the film is actually the woman that he's looking for. Is, I think he calls her Anomalisa because she's like an anomaly. He's looking for the anomaly, the surprising, different woman who's going to stay fresh and exciting to him.
Yeah.
But the woman that he keeps meeting, I can't really remember the details, but there's a kind of repetition trick in the film where the woman keeps being the same woman over and over again, or turning into the same woman.
Yeah.
So it's a very good lesson in the pitfalls of the grass is greener fantasy, but it teaches you that lesson in a very experiential way through watching the film. And so I do think that films, if they're thoughtful like that, even if they do conform to the hero's journey archetype, I do think that they can teach us lessons that are good for us.
So we started this episode happily digesting films and TV without worrying about their structure, but then we answered the call to explore why so much of what we watch is based on the same narrative. We followed wise mentors such as Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung and Dan McAdams, and faced up to the shadows of our own dark identities. Finally, now we've emerged, transformed and enlightened and ready to change the world. Well, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Thank you so much, Eliane, for joining me on this epic quest. Where can people find out more about you, your writing, your books and your radio work?
At my website, elianeglaser.com, and that's Eliane rather than Elaine.
Good. And I'll put a link in the show notes as well that people can click on that. And if you've got this far in the podcast, then I think you'll really enjoy reading Eliane's article on Aeon. You can just search for Our Narrative Prison on aeon.co. And again, I'll put the direct link in the show notes so you can do that as well. Just to say thank you once again, Eliane. And if you're listening, please follow the podcast on Instagram and TikTok at Everything's Psych. I post extra bits to accompany each episode, and I also put all the links to books and articles we've mentioned in the show notes as well. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time.